Welcome to a quick gameplay review of Betrayal at House on the Hill 3rd Edition. We'll be going over the changes from the 3rd edition to the other editions and the pros and cons of this game. We won't be going over setup or how to play though. First off, the biggest change of all of this is the scenario cards.
The scenario cards we found throughout the group were a lot of a benefit to the game. It gave a lot more narrative instructions to what to look forward to, and also it gives more control over the story later on in the game when the haunt's revealed. It doesn't quite do enough for the game. All it does essentially is gives you a limitation of the haunts available to that scenario. There's no spoilers on these cards whatsoever, which is another fantastic thing. It just simply reveals which number scenario is to which haunt, and that way there's no foretelling of the names of it. It could do a lot more. For example, it could add its own unique event tiles to the scenario cards. This would have given a lot more variety to the game, and it would have gave a unique twist to each of these cards. Sadly, all the event cards are generic and shared throughout, so there is nothing to separate these except for the haunts. And this does give a lot more narrative control to the player, but it sadly doesn't add much to the game. And throughout the game, we found that it played more or less exactly like the second one or the Legacy. There are a few game change rules. For example, how the haunt starts is through the number of dice related to how many omens are on the table. This will basically mean that any game will not start before the third omen is found, and this can help balance the game.
And what that would prevent is the first turn haunt roll, where you get the haunt immediately. This happened quite a lot to us during the Legacy.
Especially with your rolls.
And what this would do is to prevent it to at least 3 omen cards on the field, because you need a 5+.
There are many changes to the rules, and these are highlighted by important changes. The important change symbol will go throughout the entire scenario books and all of the rule books to show you what's the differences between the editions. You've got the scenario cards, the haunt rule, some of the new terms, for example, general damage, heal, buried. A lot of that comes in play from the Legacy. One of the biggest, weirdest things, but I found that has added, is the no stealing allowed. Turns end way differently now. When you enter a room, the turn ends. This gives a lot more variety to the game, and it's also able to balance a lot more. Overall, the game felt a lot more balanced than previous editions.
And talking about the game, it's, you can see, is quite more detailed as the others. There are a lot more like shadows effects, and the Mystic Elevator is the biggest change that we have seen.
It gives a lot more detail to the game board itself, but it also has its own issues, especially when you're trying to read any of the small detail. A lot of the small writing in this game is very difficult to read, and anyone with poor eyesight will suffer.
And whilst on the effect of very small writing, we can jump quickly to the cards and its different effects. With the problem with cards currently is that some people will not be able to see some of the text with poor eyesight, or
Especially if it's on the other side of the table. But that even goes to the actual players themselves. For example, it's near impossible to see the green input on any of these. You always had the green and the dark and the harder to read ones on the previous game, but this one seems to be a much deeper shade and a lot harder to see.
which would be a problem with anyone who has any type of
Did
color.
you find it at all difficult to read the cards themselves? Obviously, the graphics of the cards have changed, and there's new icons to indicate special actions that can be done on the cards. But did you find that the cards themselves had any difficulty reading?
I found a couple of cards difficult to read from a distance, so I had to get close to them in order to read, which is not good if you're on a bigger table and you want to see what other people have.
The footprints of this game is about the same as the previous editions, though. There's very little difference, in fact, throughout all of this, I found. I didn't feel that this was any different from the previous ones, with the exception of that scenario card.
And
yeah, I found other than a few changes from the tiles themselves and the cards having different effects,
Well, even
it doesn't really change much.
and also the other big thing is instead of keep on going until you draw a card. Once you draw a tile, your turn ends.
even if that tile's a blank one, I've had that more often than not. With the components we've already covered in the last video, one of the other issues that's come up was the storage of these components. As you can see, the figures will take up a lot of space in here, but the only limitation to this is what you store all the tiles in. And the tiles are pretty much the exact same ones from before, with the exception that the rules are now written on the tiles themselves. This will help new players understand what the tiles are actually doing, rather than having no clue. But again, it suffers from the difficulty of read. There doesn't seem to be much of a change, apart from the quality is too weak. A lot of that suffers throughout. The card quality is not too bad, but all the cards are pretty much, majority of them are from the previous editions. There isn't really anything new that I felt, wow, that's new, apart from the scenario cards.
I have noticed that as well. Well, I mean, we haven't gone through all the events, but because, well, we've been shuffling them as we go on, but we still haven't really found anything that's outstandingly new. It's just been old events or reworded.
One of the good things is the spoilers is very limiting, because it will give you just the number for the haunt, and then it'll go through the details of the haunt. But there's no real separation for the pages, so it would be recommended to get something to prevent viewing accidental pages. But these books I found were a lot easier to read, because one of the bigger changes is during a haunt, both sides read out the setup and the introduction to the haunt. This was something that we also appreciated, because it allowed both sides to set up the board faster. It also gave more depth to each of the objectives and what they were there for. Because a lot of the other one, it felt like you were getting half the story or none of the story. This definitely felt a lot more thematic.
This definitely felt more like an actual horror movie, where you would see both sides of the story.
Up until you get the events, which are clearly meant for different scenarios. When you get an event that says, for an example, this isn't in the game, but there's a alien invasion and you've been abducted, it kind of breaks the scenario when you're at the for sale. But if that was included into one of the events, for example, paranormal investigators, it would feel more thematic and add to it. But the haunts themselves definitely sped up the game, was easier to read. But most importantly, it was very well balanced, because the game knew how many tiles were going to be on the board roughly before it started.
And to help with the balancing, when players ask of how the other player had done a specific move or action, they have to reveal of how they did it, instead of keeping secrets, which had kept us from winning or losing.
Several games in the past, yeah. Because if there was any miscommunication with the rules from a new player, this time round the new player would have to clarify what those actions do and how they're doing them. And that will prevent mistakes from being made, which was another good addition. But all of these rules, though, can be added to the second edition. The only thing that could not be added is the scenario cards. Everything else could just be a slight tweak to the rules in the second edition. which comes to the point: is this worth getting?
Well,
Well, yes and no. It's a very what if situation.
For example, if you have the second scenario, or the second edition, and you've not really played many of them, then this isn't worth getting, because some of these scenarios are sequels, and it's not even an evolution of it.
No, it feels like a continuation of the.
Yeah, it's more of a 2.5 rather than a third edition. So I think if you have the second edition, then you don't need to pick this up if you still have majority of that to play.
and there's also expansions for the second edition, like the rooftops is not available in this edition.
But they did incorporate a lot of those rooms and a lot of those items and equipment into this game. There's just no attic.
yeah,
I'm slightly wondering if they'll add any expansions to this because it kind of felt bare bones with some of the things, especially the omens.
Well, but then again, the omens, lack of them is easier to limit what happens. But with the scenario cards, if they came with event cards and they came with a 5 or 10 haunts, then certainly that would make it a worthwhile investment. But without those event cards, you're just going to play over the same events over and over and over again. The scenarios could be improved in the future, so that'd be interesting to see. But then you have to wonder, why have they released such a low quality product? This won't last 5 or 6 years compared to the other editions, just because of how thin it is.
so overall, it's best to play the second edition if you haven't played much of it. But if you already played the Legacy and played most of the scenarios in the second edition, this would be a good game to pick up.
Talking about pickup, it's releasing worldwide in August 2022. You can pick this up if you're lucky and you live in UK or Europe by visiting websites such as Zatu that will maybe still have this in stock. It's available in April in those locations. Unfortunately, the rest of the world will have to wait until August, but it's a matter of if it's worth the wait.
Kind of say yes because if you don't have Betrayal, this is a good one to get.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong, it is good, but you're also getting sequels missions that are going to feel hollow if you haven't finished the first.
Yeah,
So-
that's the only unfortunate bit.
This game is good to get once you've completed the Legacy and you played through most of the second edition.
Do you think the miniatures have added anything to the game?
The miniatures being unpainted also made it a bit dull and confusing at times, due to me mixing up purple and blue in the board because of the lack of colour of the miniatures, and which also does not help with the vibe of the game.
What also doesn't help the miniatures is that they're basically the same situation with the cards. Bad material, both
Yeah.
hard and soft at the same time.
Which
for some
also
reason.
makes the storage of them more unique. So overall, it's a decent game that should be picked up, especially if you haven't got any other editions. But if you're looking for a fantasy Betrayal, then Baldur's Gate Betrayal is by far the most engaging fantasy thing. Betrayal Legacy is probably my favorite Legacy and Betrayal game overall. But the second one is still a viable pickup compared to this. It's available now. It's got all the same feelings and scenarios to this one. The only thing it's lacking is the scenario cards and a lot of the rules from this you can bring forward. If you had to give this a score, obviously that's a difficult thing to do, but based off the scenario that you've played so far and the games that you've played so far, what would you guys base this on?
I would base this on a 6, 7. It's still a very good game because it's like Betrayal, and on top of it, it was still a blast. It was quicker, but it lacked new content.
I agree with you that I say a solid 7, but it it's set slightly downgraded because of the quality of the actual game, and I'm not sure if it will live as long as it will.
So if they haven't got the second edition, would that change your score at all?
If the second edition didn't exist, this would be an 8 because the quality
The
would still,
uniqueness of the game.
yeah,
So.
the uniqueness.
And guys, hope that helps anyone who's unsure of the game or if they wish to pick it up. Again, check Zatsu Games or any other your online scribes. They should be in stock in August or April, depending on location. Thanks, and hopefully see you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.